carries judgments about its ethical or unethical status, okay? And within it, all violence, this is what Fanon points out, is linked to processes of what we call dehumanization, okay? Now, the thing is, what Fanon argued is that there are ways of organizing the world to try to de-socialize people, to disconnect them, okay? To limit their capacity to live an empowered life. This is crucial because Fanon is not against the concept of power. And it's not only him, I have the same position. A colonial view of power is to look at power exclusively as coercive, right? Power over, power that dominates, okay? But if we unpack power, and again, we have a short time together, the concept of power has been theorized by human beings all the way into antiquity for thousands of years. You can find it going back 6,000 years of analysis. But the short version is power is the ability to make things happen with access to the conditions of doing so. Every one of you cannot get through a day without power. Because you see, you won't be able to access, you won't be able to act. You will have no abilities. It's because we have roads, because we have language, because we have food, because we have energy. Those are the conditions that enable us to do things like walk, talk, show up. It's the very fact that we have access to electricity, computer technologies that enable us to be in this remote forum right now. Everything we're doing right now is power. But the thing about it, it's power that facilitates our ability to act, you see? But some people try to limit the conditions that people have access to. And that means that because of a lack of access to those conditions, some people use power to disempower others, to limit their capacity to act, you see? So all forms of oppression are also activities of disempowerment. It's to limit the capacity of people to act in ways that will afford them to live livable lives, okay? Once we understand that, then we start with the first premise of what Fanon is talking about. If you look at Le Dernier de la Terre, he talked about violence in other contexts, but if you look at Le Dernier de la Terre, the damned of the earth, many people know it as the wretched of the earth. A lot of people misunderstand that book because for a larger analysis. What the first chapter does is to talk about what's called an atmosphere of violence, okay? This is something that Drusilla Cornell talks about as well in her last book, which was on questions of revolution, and many others who talk about it as well. The basic point is, if you look at that first chapter, he talks about the apartheid structure of colonialism, that it separates people into contraries. Well, he argues that is violence, because you see, it's if a group of people are to be separated, then the idea is that they become the universal negation of the people who separate them. That means that ultimately, even their appearance would be considered illegal, illicit, and wrong. That is dehumanizing. So for Fanon, the way he's already described violence, there could be violence going on in an environment in which you don't see your actual flesh open. You don't see scars because there's degradation. Now, what he argues, however, is that because human beings are social, to keep people separate requires material conditions of doing so. That is the process of disempowerment. Well, we know what those material conditions are. They're the police, they're the military, they could even be mobs, right? If you have a civil society that is based on the dominating group keeping out the dominated group, then you could have a system of everyday violence, the way Ambedkar talked about it, for instance, or the question of untouchability, right? All of Ambedkar's writings is about, it's very funny because I teach a course where we look at political thought from the global south, and when people look at my list, they immediately don't really see the connections. So when in the course we read Fanon, then we read Ambedkar, and there are people who, when you think of Ambedkar as an example, they think of Ambedkar with W.B. Du Bois. I had a student who was taking the course. She's from Delhi, and she volunteered to talk about Ambedkar, but in her head, she was absolutely shocked after reading Fanon, how much of Fanon and Ambedkar agree, okay? And that's because both of them link violence to dehumanization. You see what I'm getting at? Now, I'm going to have to move a little quicker because this is a very long answer and you have a lot to talk about. We have a lot to talk about. So here's now, sorry everybody, this is now rapid speed. I took the time to set the premises. So here's the premise. Because violence is linked to the notion of having a right to, one group having a right to things and another group in effect having no rights, or being dehumanized, or ultimately almost every effort to assert their humanity is considered wrong, then the first premise of violence is that it not only creates an atmosphere of violence and dehumanization, but it often treats itself as just. So almost all ongoing atmospheres of violence try to argue for nonviolence, even though they're committing violence. So what Fanon pointed out, and Drusilla Cornell points this out, and this is what I argue as well, is that nonviolence is complicit with violence. Because to be nonviolent is to do nothing about ongoing violence. You see? If you see somebody, for instance, if there's a person sitting down and somebody walks up and starts slapping and hitting that person, if you just stand by and say, I'm nonviolent, so I'm just going to look at it, you're permitting it to continue. Now, here's the part that's interesting. If you intercede, the person who's doing it is going to respond and say, mind your own business. Who the hell are you, right? That person may even call the police over and say, this person is intervening in what I'm doing. So you see the problem, right? If you intervene, you are now structured as violent, because the person who's committing it treats his or their actions as having the right to harm the other. So the thing is, what Fanon says is to understand that if you're going to act at all against violence, you are entangled in violence, period, right? So to try to prove how nonviolent you are, so forth, you have to deal with, and I call it the tragedy of violence. The tragedy of violence is that if you're going to interact with violence, your innocence becomes irrelevant. All right? That's going to be ex post facto if you argue. At that moment, you're entangled in violence. Now, here is where Fanon brings in a different analysis. Because you see, the action at that moment is just counter-violence. However, suppose you intervene, not because you want to stop this person from harming another person, but actually, you just don't like this person. So you intervene, but now you're going to beat the crap out of this person and keep the thing going, because this was just the moment you've been waiting for. Then it means that your intervention is not counter-violence. You're intervening for the purpose of continued violence. You see? So what Fanon has is another category. The other category is anti-violence. Anti-violence is different from counter-violence because anti-violence poses a limit on violence. Anti-violence intervenes to stop violence. You see the difference? And that means because it poses a limit, it has an ethical, right, dimension to it. So for Fanon, if we talk about, say, political responsibility to avoid violence as much as you can, but if you are violent, the purpose of it is to put a limit on violence. In other words, to create the political potential for human actions and to limit that which blocks it. And that is why most of the book is actually a critique of violence. And a lot of people miss this point. But it's because he's unapologetic about the importance of intervening in violence. Right? There are critics who want him to espouse nonviolence. That is not Fanon. Okay? For him, you must stand up for yourself. You must, but here's the big difference. You don't stand up for yourself as a kind of egotistical, self-righteous, or sense of superiority. You stand up for yourself as a human being in the interest of the dignity and respect of fellow human beings, which means when you stand up for yourself, your goal is not even to dehumanize, ironically, your oppressor. Your goal is to stop oppression, you see? And it means that ultimately is to create a political environment in which people collectively learn to live better. And that's why people miss the fact that a lot of the book, Le Dernier de la Terre, is also a critique of the very revolutionaries he was fighting with, on whose side he was on. Because he began to notice that there are people in post-colonial states that sought their legitimacy through violence. For Fanon, violence doesn't offer you legitimacy. You see? For Fanon, although it's a necessary condition to struggle for liberation, liberation in and of itself is the beginning. The next task is to build a society of freedom. And so that means that what the struggle should facilitate is a new condition of legitimacy. And that legitimacy is what he argues for in the book, is to build up the nation. And you notice he makes a distinction between nationalism and the nation. Nationalism, he argues, always leads to racism and puts you on a slippery slope back into violence. Whereas building a nation is to create a condition of shared, dignified living. And that process of legitimation, he argues, is the post-colonial task.
No, this is so elaborative and deeply reflective, Prof. Because and I deliberately asked this question because it's important. I mean, apart from not just about the warfares, but also if we look at the different kinds of political conditions that are being generated under the right-wing rule across India and in other parts of the world, violence serves as a very essential tool, as an important political trope, as a very essential perspective and ideology for the right wing communities to justify their existence, to justify their violence, to justify their perspectives in the way they try to operate. And I mean, I just want to sort of, wrap our conversational part with one more question, and then for sure we can open up for the audience, and they can come in with their questions and perspectives. I was just wondering. I mean, there are so many dimensions that you talked about, which altogether, from with respect to phenomenology, with respect to violence, with a specific reference to Fanon, is what brings me to the other aspect of our conversation, and that is critical thinking. Now, why I bring this into our conversation, this whole element of critical thinking, because uh, what I also, as an individual, I closely observe, at least sitting in India, working within the Indian research, academic, socio-political scenario, with so many versions of censorships and surveillances always haunting us, threatening us from time to time. Uh, the whole process, the whole engagement with critical thinking is gradually withering away. It's all about fast paced information. It's all about believing in rumors, cherry picking ideas and manipulating and imagining them in our own ways that satisfies our self centric desires. And this is causing a lot of harm. And I'm not just talking about the physical harm, I'm talking about the emotional harm, the ideological harm, the individual harm, the collective harm, and various forms of harm. So, since you engage with these questions very, very categorically and clearly in your lectures, in your works, in your reflections on a habitual basis, uh, as an experienced scholar, as an experienced activist, Prof, what would be some of the possible pathways in which we can stop this erosion of critical thinking altogether and have some patience, have some self contemplation, to really sit down and think around before jumping into a conclusion or before running and rushing towards commenting or reacting against somebody or some certain kind of particular scenarios.
Well, Cheyenne, um, your question brings full circle uh, two elements. Okay, I raised the question of existence before, right? And you raised the question of critique or critical reflection. Okay, and they're connected. Okay, one of the scary things, for instance, about existential thinking is you do not have the answers in advance. You see, one of the things you have to take seriously if you think existentially is you do not know in advance if you are what people call the good guy or the bad guy. You may convince yourself, but there are so many examples in history or even in our personal lives where we go in with good intentions and then one day turn around and say, how did it happen that I turn out to be the bad guy? Okay? So that's already one of the ironic features of life. Okay? The second thing is you brought up the question of right wing, right? And I have to talk about this, right? Because the thing is, people throw around the terms right wing and left wing, et cetera, uncritically. But the thing is, if you unpack what it is, right, what is going on with being right wing, there are people who identify as left wing who have no clue that they're actually right wing. You see? So what do I mean? Well, first of all, I'm just going to give a very, in my writings I elaborated, but I'm just going to, for sake of time, make it very short, right? Um, the difference, the basic difference between right wing and left wing, right? Not in the question of party affiliations, okay? I'm talking in phenomenological terms, the consciousness of it, okay? Is an attitude you have towards making decisions, okay? A reality of human existence is we must make decisions, okay? The word there are many languages in which it's used, but to save time, I'm going to use Greek, okay? The reason is because the Greek word for having to make decision is krinein, right? And krinein, right, connects to the person who makes the decision, which is the krites, okay? And you could see where this is going. It's the critic, okay? So to make a decision, to be in a situation to make decisions is called crisis, right? The critic is the one who makes the decision, or the judge, okay? And the thing about it is the basis of making decisions is related, it's called criteria. You see how it connects, right? So you need the criteria to make good decisions. Okay, now here's the thing. Some people absolutely are terrified to be in crisis. So what they want is for somebody else to make the decisions or to get rid of having to make decisions at all. This usually leads to a romantic version of the past, right? The reason is, in the past, we were children, where there were these people called adults who made decisions. There was, whether you call them father, mother, whatever, but it's usually father. It tends to be patriarchal. And the idea is that this great decider often takes metaphysical forms as gods, right? So this is why the right often immediately thinks about going back. All right wings tell you you must go back, right? In the United States, we have the wackos, the fascists who are saying, make America great again. Again, it's to go back, right? Right now, there are people, if you look in India, who are imagining, right? They even actual history of the Indus Valley is a complex, diverse history, but they're presenting a version of going back that's homogeneous, right? And pure, okay? Whether it's in the UK and France, whether it's different parts of Asia, China, wherever you name it, parts of the African continent, people have this idea that it's either tradition, the gods, whoever it is, you go back. And all right wings take the position that you must get rid of diversity. Because you see, there's no way you can have diversity without having to make decisions, right? If everything's homogeneous, for instance, it's very simple. You know what your gender or your sex is. You know that who you will marry or whatever. Where everything is done. But if there's diversity, you have to make decisions. So it usually takes the form of tradition. Then it says law and order. Somebody else makes the decisions. And then it gets xenophobic. You get rid of outsiders because they disrupt decisions. Then it begins to attack often at the level of gender and sexuality, right? Because again, those tend to be more fluid. Then eventually it gets into a notion of monoculture. And then eventually there's a notion of a singular ruler or a singular group. And if you want to put it into basic psychology, eventually your friends aren't even good enough because they're other than you. And then eventually, in phenomenological terms, you're not good enough because you're looking at yourself in the world as other, and you could see it collapses. This is why turning to the right, radicalized or made into the extreme, always leads to fascism. It always leads to the idea that there's only one kind that has it right. And you notice in a lot of my writings, I'm very critical of the tendency to try to find a people out there who have everything right. Now, that's already going to the next side of this equation. Because unfortunately, there are people on the left who are taking the position that there are people out there who are intrinsically having it right. That's a right-wing view, you see? But even more, where you now have a different position is then there's another group who say, you know what? If we look at all of history, what we'll find is human beings were making decisions. So whatever past we try to go back to, it's just a past where people had to make a decision to move forward. So it's just our turn to make decisions. So let's try to make some wise decisions. Now, some people who identify, that's leftism, okay? But here's the problem. There's some people who identify as left who try to make decisions that will end decisions. So, for instance, there are people who say they're anti-status. They treat the idea that if you get rid of states, everything will be fixed. But that's one of the reasons why those kind of left individuals tend to slide in with the right, because they're looking for a panacea, something that will resolve everything. But there's another kind of leftism that says, wait a minute, this is a story about maturity. If you're the going back stuff is a devolution into childhood. If you're thinking about being an adult life is having to make decisions even when the conditions are not ideal. That is adult life. Adult life is not about if God is going to save you or who's going to save you. Adult life is about what if the entire universe doesn't give a damn about us? That's the existential problem, right? What if there's just a hostile world? You still have to find a way to live with freedom and dignity in that world. Even if the universe doesn't care about you, it's your responsibility for life. And this is the crucial part. That other kind of leftism says, you know what? If you look at all the problems we're facing, they're human created problems. I mean, look, right now, whether there's a lot of food in the world, yet there's starving people. How is that possible? It's because we've organized the world in such a way to keep people from having access to food. We've set up our economies in such a way only certain people have it. We have an ecological crisis. Why is that? Because we have organized our world in such a way that it's not only increasing the carbon, but we have set up our legal and structures in such a way that we cannot actually collectively respond to it. So we need to change our social order. If we look at states that are wrong, well, if we treat the states as if they're gods, then there's nothing you can do. But if we remember that states are created by people, then people could create different ways people organize power. So all states are human institutions of power. We need to change it. This is, by the way, straight in Fanon. It's in that text. Then there's so many other examples. If you think about your relationships, there's no such thing as a human relationship that's free of conflict, right? But there's a difference. If you think about a relationship in which there's love, but conflict, then the conflict can be productive because you're learning more about how to live together. But if you're in a relationship where suddenly the decision is not about love, but it's about enemies, then it's already about a dissolved relationship. And in that framework, there's only one goal: the eradication of the enemy. So we need also to make a distinction between productive conflict and unproductive conflict. Unproductive conflicts are wars. Their goal, ultimately, once you're at war, there's a singular goal: the elimination of the enemy. But if you're in what's called political conflicts, ordinary conflicts, life conflicts, those are conflicts in which you can grow. So from that conception of leftism, it's not that you're going to get rid of crises or you're going to get rid of conflicts. It's that you need to develop a new relationship to them that are actually going to increase our capacity to be able to make life better or more livable. And that is something radically different. So this comes now to your point about critique, because you notice critique is throughout, right? Its critique is already in decision, in crisis. And here's the part that's rather interesting. Remember I said everywhere, every existentialist I've looked at, or because Fanon was basically a radical political existentialist, okay? They all ultimately argue about critique and freedom. You'll see it not only in Fanon, but you see it in, say, Sri Aurobindo, right? If you look at Aurobindo's writings are about how humanity must take collective responsibility for the direction of consciousness, and it should cultivate freedom. That's why, for instance, despite the Varna in which he was located, he was anti, right, that system, and anti-caste. He was anti-racism. He was anti-classism. It culminated in the idea to be properly critical, you have to respect your fellow human being's capacity to grow. You will find that in the Japanese thinker, Kaiji Nishitani. That's right. All he says, he talks about, ontology covers reality, he talks about negation, but ultimately, he radically, his work culminates in the question of freedom. But he argues that true freedom always has equality embedded in it. You see? Because if you don't have equality embedded in freedom, then you're going to have coercive conceptions of power, because you will have ultimately power over another instead of a communicative power of working with others. You see? There are many we could think about with this, and you could see how this connects to another aspect of your work. Because you could see, and I'm talking about you, Shaya, because you do work also on decolonial thought. And that is ultimately that if you decolonize the conception of power, the mistake people make is they think power is colonial,
Yeah.
but they don't realize they're affirming colonialism. You must embrace the capacity to build a social world
Totally.
in which people can, through their communicative practices, cultivate a critical understanding through which freedom can grow and equality, right, can be made manifest. Anyway, I'll stop there.
I think this is such a wonderful dimension to sort of bring a pause to our conversation. And obviously, this conversation go on and on, but I don't just want to personalize the space. And as it is an adda, I would like to invite people who are there, who are still holding on to the conversation, to feel free to unmute and ask a question, or just put your thoughts in the chat box. Everything is fine. Oh, already we have one question from Arpita. So, Prof, let me just read it out for you. The question is, when we talk about freedom, is there a concept of right to freedom of violence too, which leads to the subjective and slash or manipulative version of freedom?
Great question. Thank you for that. Already, remember when I said that implicit in violence is a form of dehumanization? The thing about the word right already is that it's already in a contradiction with the notion of freedom. The thing that's very tricky, right, is that you need to think relationally. Okay? If there is a person who is imagining they have a right to dehumanize you, okay, then they're already taking the position that you're supposed to do nothing. You see? If you are going to respect your dignity and stand up for that, they're going to call your action violence. What you're doing is actually fighting against violence. It's very different at that moment. This is called a right to self-defense, a right to dignity, and a right to freedom. Now, what you're demonstrating is that the initial person who's dominating you did not have a right in the first place. That is what you're doing in that action. There's certain things that are not right in the first place. In a lot of my writings, I bring up the concept of the distinction between privilege and license as an example. Today, a lot of people talk about privileged people, but they distort the discourse, because if we unpack what a lot of people are calling privileges, if you look carefully, there are things that everybody should have. If we say you're privileged, you have education, you're privileged, you have clean water, you're privileged, you have healthcare, you're privileged, you have a job. Everybody should have access to healthcare, clean water, being treated fairly by law, employment, etc. You see what I'm getting at? So the real issue in that conversation is not that somebody has it. The real issue is that others don't. So that's something you could politically struggle for. You see what I'm saying? However, there's another category, which is when people have access to something that no one should have access to. Okay? And as an example, suppose someone says, I have a right to kill whoever I want. I have a right to rape whoever I want. I have a right to take anybody's goods I want. You see where I'm going with that? How in the world is that a right? However, there are societies in which we have set up a social system to have people who get away with all those things. There are people who can lynch people and pose with pictures in front of the dead body. That is not a right. But if they could get away with it, that's a license. The things that we're seeing that's growing across the world from the various right wings, right? And you brought up a variety of countries. So yeah, it's happening all over the Middle East. It's happening all over Eastern Europe. It's happening over South Asia. It's happening over parts of the African continent. And that's because there are people nostalgic for a notion of being able to do whatever they want without impunity, right? Even when people talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict, there are people who want to talk about it in a way in which one group has a right and another group doesn't. But one of the things that's problematic is that if we're talking about right wings, then we're talking about right that on many sides there are people who want to be, but the basic premise, right, from Fanon all the way through to people like Hannah Arendt, through Amilcar Cabral, but also people like, as I mentioned, Aurobindo, all the way through to people even like myself. There's no such thing as an unaccountable state, an unaccountable leader. Once we're talking about human phenomena, everybody's accountable. You see what I'm saying? I would even push it further, even into the South African concept of Ubuntu. But there are other African concepts. Ubuntu is talking about the human collective responsibility. People who have what I call license. Those are people who see themselves as above accountability. And when you have people who are above accountability, their relationship to all of the rest of humanity is violence. You see? So I would argue that to make sure there is no group of people who are above humanity. And this means that we get rid of the notion that there's a people who could have license. Even if you are a member of the group who has license, you could take the moral and political position that nobody should have that license. Oops, excuse me a second. Honey, I'm being in a recording. I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry, home thing. But anyway, so what happens is that that's a very good colleague. Since I said his name, he's a very extraordinary philosopher from Senegal, Hadiba, who was here. Anyway, so the thing is, even if you're located in the group, you see the era we have now when we created perfect people and bad people, the dichotomous ways, those are forms of dehumanization. Fanon pointed out that there are people, if you make them above people, the superior people, that's a dehumanization. You make them gods. You say there are people below people, that's dehumanization. If you are located in there, what we need is political action to get rid of creating people who are above and people below. People together should be there. That's the equality with freedom. So the argument then is that ultimately what's needed is political action. And political action must have as a condition of its possibility equality. Everybody must be able to act politically. Okay? Now, of course, this is not to romanticize people. It doesn't mean that everybody who acts is coming from a good place or understands things a certain way. But there can be a commitment to doing one's best to work together for the common good. Okay? And I could give an example. Sometimes I've given talks where I would say it really doesn't bother me that there are unethical or immoral or bad people in the world. What bothers me is when we give them a lot of power. Because at that point, they could have a knee on my neck, they could be destroying communities, there could be all kinds of things. However, if you take that power away, and now they have to deal with everybody else as an equal human being, then I'm fine. And I'm not going to obsess myself with eradicating those people. I'd rather focus on people with whom I could work to make the common good better. And that's the political task. The political task is for human beings to take responsibility for building the conditions of livable life.
I think Orpita's question very well also connects to the other two questions as well. One is from Haifa. So Haifa asks that how far is the autobiographical approach significant in understanding the phenomenology of violence, bringing together phenomenology and autobiography? And she adds to that, I am referring to this because Fanon's writings were also autobiographical. Also, in that context, when does personal become collective in our shared reality? Can that be used in comparative approaches? And I don't know, Prof, I mean, do you think you want to take the other question as well and then proceed, or
Sure.
just want to? Okay.
Yeah, let's get, if there are a lot of questions, just bring them all and I could, that way
Sure.
people could learn from the questioners.
Sure. And Rangnath asks the question again, turns towards the question of violence and non-violence. So Rangnath says that you said non-violence is implicit in violence. To bring Gandhi here, how would we understand the dichotomy between non-violence and violence, especially if we bring Gandhi and Fanon together?
Okay, is there another one?
Not yet, Prof.
Okay, well, in terms of the first one, let's make a phenomenological point, right? But in a very different way. Let's start with the notion of experience, okay? Because if we're talking about the autobiographical, we're talking about someone's experience. In the autobiographical case, it's one's own, okay? Now, what's very interesting about experience is, and I've written about this, I talked about it in my book, Existentia Africana, but I talk about it in other places as well. Everybody has the experience of trying to figure out their experience, okay? In other words, an experience by itself is, something's happened. It has content, but it doesn't necessarily have intelligibility or meaning. You see? What I find striking is whenever we have an experience we're trying to figure out, if you look at everybody who is listening right now, think about when you've had that experience. You've never actually figured it out by yourself. Whenever something happened that is unintelligible or unclear to you, you often go to find someone else to talk about it with, right? Somebody with whom to discuss it. It could be your best friend, your spouse, your parent, your sibling, your coworker, whoever it is. It always needs to be another. You see? So already, and what happens is, as you talk about it, it goes back and forth, and together you begin to bring a hermeneutics, an interpretation, and eventually that begins to bring what's called intelligibility. And eventually it begins to connect to reality in ways that bring what's called a theory. And that theory enables you now to make sense in such a way that you can act. Okay? Now, what I just did was to articulate a phenomenological critique of the notion of experience by itself. Experience is relational. Remember when I said consciousness must be consciousness of something? Well, experience is also prepositional. It has to be of something. You don't just experience. You have an experience of going to the store, an experience of love, an experience of harm, an experience of humiliation, an experience of redemption, an experience of joy. You know, it's off. Now, the question of autobiographical work, then, it's rather tricky because you see, this is a methodological thing among existential writers. Kierkegaard used it, Fanon used it, I've used it, many others. If you use it purely to talk about yourself, that's a very different issue. However, if you're using the autobiographical heuristically as a learning mechanism, right? Then the purpose of the autobiographical in that context is actually to bring another into a shared reality through which you're working something out. If you look at, for instance, Peau Noire Masque Blanc, Black Skin, White Mass, his first published book in 1952. The four chapters analyze a series of phenomena, and every chapter results in failure. Okay? He looks at the failure at the level of language, failures of love, failures of effort, an effort to escape. And all the failures are an effort to try to fix oneself instead of addressing the world. Okay? Now, at that moment, Fanon structurally is going to look like, almost like a superior position of judgment onto others. But then what does he do? In the fifth chapter, L'expérience vécue de Noir, the lived experience of the Black, Fanon then puts himself as the Black, right? He's not trying to say everyone, but he puts himself in. So he throws the critic the theorist, into the situation of being the patient, the client, the subject. And what that chapter is about, if you read that chapter, it's about failure. So here is the author of the book, the philosopher, the psychiatrist, the political figure, is telling the story of his own failure to address the problem. What he's doing is two things in that act. One thing he's doing, because it's called experience vécue, right? The lived experience, is up to this point, people tend to talk about dominated subjects externally. You see? Tend to talk about dominated subjects as if it's pure epidermal things. By just raising his inner life, he sets up an intersubjective relationship with the reader. And so at this moment, there's a lived reality that's shared. But by making the chapter culminate in failure, he announces his equality to the reader. You see what I'm getting at? It makes the reader now face a self-critique that would now lead to intersubjective experience. And if you look at the chapters that succeed that, they're chapters on recognition. In effect, Fanon is saying, in my failure, do you see yourself? You see? Because and that means in your failures, do I see myself? That is an extraordinary act of love, right? Because for people who want to have a colonial conception of love, they want to be above you or reproduce themselves as perfect. But if you're open to the idea of your imperfection, then the radicality of love is the ability to love one another with our vulnerabilities. You see? And that's why he ends that book with a question. So the autobiographical here is what we call it's paradoxical, because it's narcissistic in the sense of mirroring the self, but it's not narcissistic in the sense of an effort to construct the self as perfect. It's the willingness to shatter the mirror. And he says it, right? Break the mirror apart and to raise the question of social construction of shared meaning. Okay? So that part is a very crucial element in which we have to be willing to understand that even the self is not a closed idea, but a relational one. And this, as you know, is not only in a lot of African thought, it's in a lot of South Asian thought. It's right there. If we think about, for instance, if we think about certain concepts through which we could think about a concept like shunyata, the kind of emptiness that could be out there. Or if we think about certain ways in which we will address issues of the complexity of dealing with life in ways that we don't completely control. Okay? That is a crucial element. Now, just so I don't say it in a misguided way, could you repeat the second one again? I just want to make sure I have it right.
Sure, Prof. So the second question by Rangnath says that thanks for the brilliant conversation. You said non-violence is implicit in violence. To bring Gandhi here, how would we understand the dichotomy between non-violence and violence, especially
Okay.
if we bring Gandhi and Fanon together?
Yeah, now I just want to make sure, that I don't misrepresent the question. Thank you for that. Well, this is where I do think, you see, Gandhi was a more complicated figure, okay? Not more complicated than Fanon, but a different kind of complicated figure. Because you see, Gandhi was in the context of the British Empire, where the British Empire was already building in it the cultivation of a managerial class that mediates the empire, right? And its relationship to the general society, but especially the people who are at the bottom. And this is why I say, this is where, as we know, the conflict that Ambedkar had with Gandhi is really crucial. I see Fanon and Ambedkar is more connected than Fanon and Gandhi. But the reason Gandhi could argue in a certain way is because, one, Gandhi had the advantage of a powerful elite. Two, Gandhi had the advantage of a well-trained, mediated military that was there. But next, Gandhi was dealing with a complicated issue of a form of nationalism that expected to rule post-British independence. The nonviolence argument, I would argue, in Gandhi was not really about the British. I would argue, right, and there are people who could disagree with me on this, but there are some who have studied Gandhi. For instance, Vashna Jarganat wrote her dissertation on Gandhi around this. It's a very crucial thing. Gandhi was very good at manipulating symbols. But ultimately, what Gandhi was arguing for was the ascent of a particular group that Ambedkar really knew was going to radicalize the inequalities. Okay? So the nonviolence argument was going to be connected to the post-colonial India, because a lot of those people, right, a lot of the people who are outside of Hindu nationalism are going to face their disenfranchisement. And so that's a very different political thing. Whereas Fanon was a radical secularist. Fanon's position was very different. Fanon's position was that you needed to have a society in which all members were equal, so it needed to have an organic secularism emerge out of it. And this is an issue that's faced, as we know, in many post-colonial states, precisely because the elites create a false dichotomy between the religions and colonialism by trying to define secularism as a Western colonial effort, right? However, if you look at the actual history of colonialism, it's religion itself that's been used to radicalize colonial grip. So what would be the example? Well, the thing to think about, whether it's Islam, whether it's Buddhism, Hinduism, the list is long, right? Whether it's Judaism, Christianity, we can go with Zoroastrianism, we could go through a long list. But here's the basic element. In many societies, there's always, remember I said there's no society without internal conflict? There's already an organic conflict around the question of religion and secularization, okay? Because, and in other words, they have their own way of articulating a secular identity. The scholar I just referred to, Hariba, discusses this in the context of Senegal, okay? There are people, Senegal is a 95% Muslim society, yet the majority of society endorses secularism, okay? The majority. Now, why? Because they don't see secularism as becoming a French person or a European. And that's because they don't see Islam as becoming a Middle Easterner. They have an understanding of African Islam. You see what I'm getting at? And so because they have an African national identity, whether it's Fulani or Wolof or etc., their view is, in a country that has the biggest mosque in the world, that they could have a secularism. Secularism for them is to bring out their African identity, that there are many ways to be Africans in Senegal, right? Whether that will be maintained is a different issue. But now we bring it in South Asian contexts and many others that are similar. That, again, if one were to think about the variety of nations outside of the religious frameworks, one begin to notice that one has to find a way to live together, which requires a secularism that also embraces respect for the other religions. In other words, the mistake people think is that secularism has to be the eradication of religions. No, it's having a relationship in such a way that one can actually have different ways of interpreting and living one's cultural life. Now, so if we bring it to the question of Gandhi, I do think that this is where the big difference between Fanon and Gandhi would stand. Uh, Ultimately, as we know, Gandhi saw a lot, was defending more the question of the varieties of Agnas, and actually was trying to claim somehow that there could be an independent ethical life when this was a profoundly political problem. Because Fanon started with it as a political problem. For him, you have to intervene. And this is one of the reasons why violence comes to the fore. Because the moment you intervene, the idea, if for Ambedkar, it's a very similar thing too. You have to intervene on the dehumanization and the treatment of the varieties of people who are pushed into the category of Dalits or untouchables, or the people outside of the framework who are technically all untouchable. You see? But it's not just there. It'll be a similar thing if you're in China or in Japan, right? Wherever you may be, ultimately, if you're going to have a political solution, it requires dialectical interaction, which means you are going to face conflicts. The real issue is to try to reduce the extent to which conflict will be war. Okay? Because in conflicts, and this is very crucial, in conflicts, there are people who could be offended, but we should not conflate offense with violence. You see? Violence comes in at the point in which you're diminishing the other's capacity to act. You see? And there are times in societies, for instance, where things do occur. If somebody is, for instance, forcefully depriving others from their ability to live their lives, it's important collectively to intervene. And there are many societies that do this. This is, as I said, I see it in the spirit of Ubuntu. But it's not only Ubuntu. There are many societies that have these forms of meaning. So, yes, Fanon would say, Fanon would have a lot of problems with Gandhi. And people who have written on this, by the way, it's not only me saying it. What Fanon's critique of Gandhi would be is precisely the problem of nonviolence. What Fanon would say is Gandhi should be anti-violence. And anti-violence will require interceding, interacting, intervening on the behalf of communities that are ultimately dehumanized in the society. And it's not just about, say, in India, because let's face it, we are in a conversation right now where we're talking about, for instance, people all across the globe, Palestinians in Gaza. We're talking about Ukrainians in Ukraine. We're talking about the question of the varieties of indigenous peoples of the Sudan. We're talking about what's happening in the Congo, right? And this is not to conflate them all. Each of them have a specific struggle. But at the heart of all of these is this deep, deep, deep down understanding we have as human beings that it is our collective responsibility right now. And this is ironically a point I do think at which Fanon, Ambedkar, and Gandhi could meet. Because Gandhi ultimately, despite all of these moves he makes, is ultimately talking about collective human responsibility. Okay? Which means that they could have a big debate. The three of them are dead right now. And if we believe that the ancestors, I'm sure there's a debate going on among the ancestors around this issue.
I think it's a fantastic note. It's on a very fantastic note that we can actually conclude our conversation, and I'm sure that there is so much to take away for all of us from this whole sort of conversations around the question of phenomenology, about the questions of violence and non-violence,
Oh,
and
there's someone
also
with a hand up.
oh sure, yeah, sure, Rangnath, please go ahead.
Good evening, sir. First of all, it's my privilege to say hello to Gordon, sir. So
Good to
actually,
meet
I'm
you.
working on Gandhian finance. So it would be a great help from your answer that you elaborated right now. So thank you so much, sir. And I have just one query that in Gandhi, I have read somewhere that even Gandhi said at one point of time that against oppression, if you don't have any other option, then you can take arms. And in Fanon, again, as you were elaborating in your lecture as well, that he is not someone who is propagating violence all the time. He's sometimes telling that violence is fine, but you should not create a state or build a nation. Well, there will be only violence and violence. So he's somewhere stopping and limiting violence as well. So don't you think that both Gandhi and Fanon has been like stereotyped? Like Fanon has been always attached to violence, and Gandhi has always been stereotyped as a propagator of non-violence only. Whereas the intention of both the thinkers somewhere matches with each other.
Thank you for making that point. You're absolutely correct. What I was responding to is the popular interpretation of Gandhi as a deontological or absolute nonviolent position. But you're absolutely correct. And what I was hinting at in my initial discussion of Gandhi was in a context where it was clear where arms could be taken up. Absolutely. The thing and what the thing about both of them that they had in common is they both detested violence. And Fanon, yes, is very explicit. For Fanon, if you really detest violence, you have to be anti-violence, which means you have to know the context in which you must act. Ultimately, it's important to stand up against the dehumanization of oneself and others. And this is, but again, with both of them, there's also, as I said at the end, an understanding of our collective responsibility as human beings. Okay? You notice even when I talked about the example of how people even think of an oppressor with anti-violence, that ultimately there's a point you pose a limit because ultimately even your oppressor is a human being, that you have an ethical obligation to place a limit on what you do to another human being. And this is one of the reasons why today it's a very dangerous period in which there are people who are completely writing off the humanity of the side they're not on. You see? There are people, for instance, in certain conflicts right now who would completely, absolutely do not want to even entertain the harm that would be done to, say, Jews, right? What happened on October 7th? They don't even want to talk about it. But the fact is, that is dehumanization, that's violence. And then there are people who don't want to talk about the fact that we have nearly 40,000 people killed. And that is violence. That is war. But the fact of the matter is, what both of them, right, would bring in here is to point out that we as a species right now need to start working on making very clear that war is no longer viable. We need to start organizing our institutions and our political orders in such a way that we can actually resolve our conflicts in ways that will deal with the responsibility for everyone. And that's going to be a much more difficult task, but we'll have to wage it. I guess it goes full circle to something that Cheyenne raised earlier when he was asking about how do we bring this on as the right keeps growing, right? The right always promises immediacy, okay? And this is where anybody who's thinking the longer plan is at a disadvantage. Because you see, the thing about the immediate, it's hate and destruction can be done quickly, right? But the problem is in the rubble, what do you do? Building is a more difficult task, okay? What we face right now is the ongoing restructuring of how we organize power in the world in such a way that we can undermine, right, the seduction of the reverie in violence. And among them, it's a long-term goal, but among them, I would argue, you remember earlier when I talked about nations? I do think we need to disentangle nations from states. I do think all around our planet, and there's nothing wrong with having nations, but I don't think we should have nation states anymore. As long as we have nation states, we're going to produce illegal people, we're going to have degraded people, etc. I do think we need to have planetary movement and planetary collective control of in a way that will enable us to intervene in all of those problems I talked about earlier. And I do think that the people are talking about, whether it's Gandhi, Ambedkar, Cabral, the list is long, all the way through to Biko and others. I do think all of collective human responsibility for producing a better planet. And one of the things we have to bear in mind is we also have to have some humility. Look, our species has only been around 300,000 years. You know, Homo erectus had nearly a million-year run. They were far more successful than we are. And look, even if we were to do a pretty good run, we know humanity is not going to be here forever. We know that. But the thing is, every one of us also know in our lives, we are not going to individually be here forever. But that doesn't stop us individually from trying to live a meaningful life. Well, similarly, I think we collectively need to have our species have a meaningful time on our precious planet. But thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rangnath, and thank you so much, Professor Gordon. I think it's time to bring a close to the session, but also it's really so encouraging to see how the conversations are building up and it's how it's ongoing. And But thank you so much, all of you, for being here. I know for those of us who are in India, it's a bit on the late evening side, and
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
and thank you so much, Prof. Gordon. I mean, especially for we can already see the virtual applauds that are going around, which once again deeply acknowledges the fantastic conversation, the fantastic reflections of you, Prof. Gordon, and thank you for being very much with us, for sharing your insights. We will actually put up the recording as well, either in this one part or in two parts. And so, for those of you who would like to, revisit the whole conversation, please feel free to do that. Please also feel free to share it with your peers and friends whom you think would be interested in such conversations. So yes, thank you wherever you are. Have a restful evening, night, and morning and afternoon. And please take care of yourself. And I'm sure we will get a scope to come back again and continue with the conversations. Have a nice time and please take care.